Welcome back, everyone, to the Mad Genius Thesis, where we try to get to the bottom of this whole thing. Is there a link between creativity and mental illness?
Yeah, it's a question that's fascinated people for centuries, right?
Absolutely. And today, we're really diving deep into the work of a researcher who's tackling this really complex topic head-on, Simon Kyaga.
Oh, Kyaga. His research is fascinating. He goes way beyond those typical anecdotes about, the tortured artist stereotype. He's looking at large-scale data, genetics. He's using brain imaging, trying to get a much more scientific picture of what might be going on.
So before we get into all the really cool stuff that he's discovered, can you tell us a little bit about who Simon Kyaga is for people who might not be familiar?
Sure. He is a Swedish psychiatrist and a researcher working at the Karolinska Institute.
The Karolinska Institute. Now, that's a name with some serious scientific weight behind it.
Right. That's where they award the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine. So, he's in a pretty good place to be studying the human mind.
Definitely. Impressive credentials.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into his findings, let's back up a little. How do researchers even define creativity? It seems like such a subjective thing, like what one person considers creative, another might think is total nonsense.
You're absolutely right. It's a really tricky concept to pin down. Researchers often distinguish between different levels of creativity. So, you have big C creativity, which refers to those groundbreaking discoveries, masterpieces of art, things that have a major impact on the world.
Okay, so we're talking Einstein's theory of relativity, Mozart's symphonies, Picasso's paintings.
Exactly. But then you also have little c creativity. That's the everyday kind of creativity we all engage in, problem solving, coming up with new ideas, even just expressing yourself in a unique way.
Right, like figuring out a workaround when your computer crashes or coming up with a new recipe for dinner.
Exactly. And there's even a level below that, mini-shi, which refers to those first sparks of creative interpretation we see in young children, making up stories, drawing pictures, finding shapes in the clouds. It's fascinating how those early expressions can kind of lay the groundwork for later creative development.
It's like a spectrum of creativity then, from those tiny little sparks to the massive world-changing breakthroughs. But where does mental illness fit into all of this? That's the big question, right?
Right, the million-dollar question. And the idea that there's a link between madness and genius, it's an old idea, like way old. It goes back to ancient Greece.
Oh yeah, the ancient Greeks, they had that whole divine madness concept, didn't
They did. They believed that creativity was like a gift from the gods, this kind of inspired frenzy. But they also valued reason and logic, so it was a bit of a balancing act for them. Later in the Renaissance, the focus shifted more towards imitation and perfecting existing forms.
Interesting. So it seems like every historical period has had its own take on this connection between creativity and mental states.
Oh, absolutely. And then you have the Romantic era with its emphasis on powerful emotions, imagination. That really blurred the lines between artistic expression and mental instability. This is when you start to see those stereotypes of the brooding poet, the tortured artist really taking hold.
Ah, yes. The Romantic era. Lots of drama, lots of tortured souls. But it wasn't just, artistic movements shaping these ideas, right? Weren't there also scientists trying to find concrete evidence for this link?
Right. You can't forget people like Cesare Lombroso in the late 1800s who really pushed the idea that genius and what they called degeneration were somehow linked. Of course, his work is considered quite controversial today.
I can imagine. It's a good reminder that the way we view things, especially things like mental illness and creativity, it's always shaped by the social and cultural context of the time.
Exactly. We have to be aware of those influences, especially as we get into the modern research. We don't want to fall into the trap of just confirming pre-existing biases.
Well said. So how does modern research approach this question differently? What are some of the tools researchers like Simon Kyaga are using to try and get a clearer picture of what's really going on?
They're using a bunch of really interesting approaches. One is twin studies. So they compare identical twins to fraternal twins to see how much of a particular trait is influenced by genetics versus the environment.
Okay, so if creativity is highly heritable, meaning it's strongly influenced by genes, we'd expect identical twins who share 100% of their genes to be more similar in their creative abilities than fraternal twins who only share about 50%, right?
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that studies show that the heritability of mental illnesses, like schizophrenia, for example, is actually much higher than the heritability of creativity.
Really. So genes might play a role in both, but not necessarily in the same way.
Right. It's not a simple one-to-one relationship. Like Kyaga found that schizophrenia has a heritability of around 80%, which is pretty high. But creativity estimates, they range from about 20% to 50%.
Wow, so genes aren't destiny when it comes to creativity, but they definitely seem to be part of the equation.
Absolutely. And then you have brain imaging. Techniques like MRI, EEG, even PET scans. These allow researchers to actually see what's happening in the brains of creative people while they're engaged in different tasks.
It's amazing that we can actually observe the creative process unfolding in the brain. That's just mind-blowing to me.
I know, right? It's still a relatively young field, but it's already giving us some really intriguing clues. For example, we're learning more about the role of the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in planning and abstract thought, and how it interacts with other brain areas during those creative moments.
So are they actually finding a difference in brain activity between people who are considered highly creative and those who aren't?
Well, it's complicated, but yes, there are some patterns emerging. Certain areas seem to be more active, others less active, depending on the task, but we're just scratching the surface.
Fascinating. And of course, there's the whole search for specific genes that might be linked to creativity. Have they found any creativity genes yet?
Oh, if only it were that simple. Creativity, like most complex human traits, is influenced by many genes, each with a small effect. It's not like there's one single gene that determines whether you'll be a creative genius, but they have identified some interesting candidates, especially genes that are involved in the dopamine system.
Dopamine. Isn't that the feel-good neurotransmitter? What does that have to do with creativity?
Dopamine's much more than just feel good, though it definitely plays a role in that. It's actually crucial for a whole bunch of brain functions: movement, attention, learning, and yes, reward and motivation. And Kiaga's work suggests that some of those dopamine-related genes might be associated with higher creativity scores. Maybe it's because their brains are wired to find creative thinking more rewarding, more intrinsically motivating.
So they get a dopamine rush from coming up with a new idea. That's so cool.
You could say that. It's really interesting to think about how our biology might be playing a role in that drive, that passion for creative expression that we see in highly creative individuals.
Okay, this is all really interesting, but let's get to what Kyaga himself discovered. What did he actually find in terms of specific mental illnesses and how it might be linked to creativity?
Well, one of his most notable findings was a link between bipolar disorder and creative professions, especially in artists.
Bipolar disorder, huh? But you said earlier that it's not the illness itself that makes someone creative. So what's going on there?
Right. It's more likely that certain personality traits or ways of thinking that you often find in people with bipolar disorder can actually be strengths when it comes to creative thinking. For example, think about those periods of heightened energy and focus that people with bipolar experience. Sometimes even a kind of expansive, big picture thinking.
So those bursts of energy and inspiration could be fueling those incredible periods of creative output that we often associate with artists, writers, musicians.
That's the idea. And it's not just anecdotal, it's been observed in lots of studies. But of course, we have to remember that there's another side to bipolar disorder. The depressive episodes can be incredibly debilitating. So managing the illness, finding that balance is really crucial.
That makes sense. It's about finding a way for those creative impulses to be expressed, but in a healthy and productive way.
Exactly.
So what about schizophrenia? Is there a similar link there?
That one's a bit more complicated. Kyaga did find a small link to artistic professions in one of his studies, but it wasn't as strong when he looked at larger groups of people. So the relationship between schizophrenia and creativity, it's less clear-cut. We need more research to really understand what's going on.
Maybe it has something to do with how schizophrenia affects different people in such different ways.
Yeah, that's definitely possible. And it's also important to remember that correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because we see a link between two things, it doesn't mean one causes the other. There could be other factors involved that we haven't figured out yet.
Right. It's a reminder to stay open-minded and not jump to conclusions.
Exactly.
Okay, this is all very interesting, but what about Kyaga's work really stands out to you? What's the most surprising or intriguing finding so far?
For me, it's what he discovered when he looked at the relatives of people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And you're not going to believe this.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
He found that the healthy relatives of these individuals are actually more likely to be in creative professions compared to the general population.
Wait, seriously? That's amazing. It seems like that kind of turns the whole traditional mad genius idea on its head.
It really does. It suggests that there might be something inherited, not the illness itself, but maybe some underlying predisposition, some set of traits that can manifest in different ways. Maybe it's certain personality traits, maybe it's cognitive styles, maybe even differences in how the brain is wired. And those same traits, under the right circumstances, could be assets when it comes to creative thinking.
So it's like a double-edged sword then.
Yeah.
You might inherit this potential for creativity, but also the vulnerability to mental illness. And which way it goes depends on this whole complex interplay of other factors.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights how complex this relationship is. We can't just make simple statements about mental illness causing creativity or vice versa.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Genes, environment, experience, all shaping who we are and what we're capable of. This is all incredibly fascinating.
It is.
We'll be back with part 2 of our deep dive into the work of Simon Kyaga, so stay tuned for more mind-bending insights. And we're back, still digging into this fascinating connection between creativity and mental illness with the work of Simon Kyaga.
You know, one thing that I find really interesting about Kyaga's approach is he doesn't just look at mental illness as like this, big monolithic thing. He breaks it down, looks at specific conditions like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and tries to see if there are unique patterns there.
Right, and we were just talking about his findings on bipolar disorder. Could you remind us, what were the main takeaways there, and what might they mean for our understanding of creativity?
Sure. So Kyaga, along with many other researchers, has found this pretty consistent link between bipolar disorder and creative professions, especially artists.
But you were careful to point out that it's not the illness itself that's making someone creative, right?
All right, exactly. It's more likely that that certain personality traits or ways of thinking that are often present in people with bipolar disorder, those things can actually be strengths when it comes to creative thinking. So think about it. People with bipolar disorder, they often experience these periods of heightened energy, intense focus, sometimes even like a kind of expansive thinking, seeing the big picture.
So it's almost like those bursts of energy and inspiration are like fueling those incredible periods of creativity that we often associate with artists, writers, musicians.
That's the idea. And it's not just anecdotal, like this has been observed in numerous studies, but of course it's really important to remember that there's another side to bipolar disorder, right? The depressive episodes, which can be incredibly difficult. So managing the illness, finding that balance, that's crucial. So those creative impulses can be expressed effectively.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. It's all about finding that balance. So what about schizophrenia? Did Kyaga find a similar kind of link there?
Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. Some of his earlier research did kind of hint at a possible connection with artistic professions, but when he looked at larger groups of people, those findings weren't as strong.
So it's possible there is a link there, but maybe it's just weaker, or maybe there are other factors influencing the results that we haven't fully accounted for yet.
Yeah, that's what, further research needs to explore. And it's also important to remember that schizophrenia, just like any mental illness, really, it affects people in very different ways. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. It's a spectrum, which makes studying its relationship to something as complex as creativity, even more challenging, right?
Oh, absolutely. But, for me, the most fascinating part of Kyaga's research is what he found out about the relatives of people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder.
Oh, yes, the healthy relatives phenomenon. Tell us more about that. It was such a surprising finding.
Yeah, so remember, he found that the healthy relatives of individuals with these mental illnesses, they're actually more likely to be in creative professions compared to the general population. Isn't that just mind-blowing?
It really is. It almost seems like it completely flips that traditional mad genius idea on its head.
Yeah, totally. It suggests that there might be something that's inherited, not the illness itself, but maybe like a predisposition or a set of traits that can manifest in different ways. So maybe it's certain personality characteristics, maybe cognitive styles, maybe even like differences in how the brain is wired that are kind of linked to these mental illnesses. And those same traits, under the right circumstances, could be the very things that contribute to creative thinking.
It's almost like winning the genetic lottery, but with a twist.
Yeah.
right? You might get the genes for creativity, but also this vulnerability to mental illness. And then like what happens next, which way it goes, depends on this whole host of other factors.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, it really highlights the complexity of this relationship, right? We can't just make these blanket statements saying that, mental illness causes creativity or the other way around. It's way more complicated than that.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. Genes, environment, personal experiences all weaving together. Mind-boggling, really.
It is, and it's a reminder that simple answers are rarely the right ones when we're trying to understand something as multifaceted as the human mind.
Okay, before we move on, I want to kind of circle back to something we talked about earlier, the dopamine connection. You mentioned that Kyaga found a link between certain dopamine-related genes and creativity. Could you explain that a little bit more? Like, why is dopamine so important here?
Oh, yeah. So dopamine, it's a neurotransmitter. It plays a key role in lots of different brain functions, things like movement, attention, learning. But probably what it's best known for is its role in reward, motivation, and pleasure. It's what gives you that feeling of satisfaction when you achieve something or experience something pleasurable.
Okay, so I can see how that might tie into creativity. Like if you get a surge of dopamine when you solve a problem or come up with a new idea, wouldn't that make you want to keep going, to keep exploring, to keep creating?
Exactly, and that's what some of Kyga's research suggests. People who have certain variations in genes that are related to dopamine, they seem to score higher on measures of creativity. It's possible that their brains are actually wired in a way that makes creative thinking more rewarding, more intrinsically motivating for them.
So they're kind of driven by dopamine to be creative.
In a way, yeah. It's really fascinating to think about how like our biology might be contributing to that drive, that passion for creative expression that we see in some people.
This is all incredibly thought-provoking. But before we get too carried away with the dopamine theory, like, I have to bring up the critiques again. I'm sure some people listening are thinking, well, if it's all about dopamine, can't we just boost everyone's dopamine levels and create a world full of geniuses?
Yeah, I understand that line of thinking. But it's a dangerous oversimplification, I think. It's important to remember that these genetic findings, they're still relatively new, We need much more research to confirm them and to really understand how genes, environment, personal experiences, how it all interacts.
Because as we keep saying, correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. And even if there is a strong link between dopamine and creativity, it doesn't mean it's the only factor or that we can just manipulate it in some simple way. The human brain is incredibly complex. Creativity, it's this multifaceted phenomenon. It's not just a simple equation of more dopamine equals more creativity.
Right. It's about appreciating that complexity.
Yeah.
And not trying to reduce something as intricate as human creativity down to a single variable.
Exactly. We have to be cautious about over-interpreting findings, and not reduce things down too much.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to bring up another kind of another important distinction. You mentioned earlier that Kyaga, he looks at both artistic creativity and scientific creativity.
Yeah.
Is there a difference in how those relate to mental illness?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something researchers are still trying to figure out. Some studies suggest there might be different patterns. So with bipolar disorder, for example, there seems to be a stronger link to artistic creativity, while the connection between schizophrenia and scientific creativity, that might be weaker or just more nuanced.
So maybe that stereotype of the tortured artist, maybe it does have some basis in reality.
Yeah, there's definitely a long history of associating bipolar disorder, which used to be called manic depression, with artistic genius, right? Think about Vincent van Gogh, Sylvia Plath, Virginia Woolf, all incredibly talented artists who struggled with this illness.
But, of course, we have to be really careful not to romanticize mental illness. It's a serious condition that requires care and support.
Absolutely. But it is interesting that some of the traits that are often associated with bipolar disorder, that heightened energy, the racing thoughts, the unusual connections, they might actually be assets in artistic pursuits.
Like those characteristics can be they can be channeled into creative expression.
Yeah, that's the idea. Of course, it's important to remember that not everyone with bipolar disorder is an artist, and not all artists have bipolar disorder. It's a complex interplay of many factors.
Right. So what about scientific creativity then? What have researchers observed about its relationship to mental illness?
Well, the link to mental illness, especially as schizophrenia, it seems to be less clear-cut in scientific fields. Some studies have suggested a possible connection, but it's not as strong as what's been observed with bipolar disorder and artistic creativity.
Do we have any theories about why that might be?
One possibility is that scientific creativity often requires a different set of cognitive skills and maybe even personality traits compared to artistic creativity.
So like in science, you need to be very logical, analytical, detail-oriented. Whereas in art, it might be more about intuition, emotion, breaking the rules.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. And it's possible that the ways of thinking that are associated with some mental illnesses, like schizophrenia, for example, might be less well suited to the rigorous demands of scientific work.
But of course, there are always exceptions to the rule, right?
Of course, we're talking about like general trends here, not absolute truths. And we have to remember that creativity is just this complex phenomenon. It can't be like easily categorized or put into neat boxes.
Right. So, while there might be some intriguing differences between artistic and scientific creativity in how they relate to mental illness, it's still a very wide open area for research.
Absolutely. There's so much more we need to learn about how these different forms of creativity work, how they're influenced by genetics, environment, personal experiences, and how those might connect to the unique features of various mental illnesses.
Well, I'm definitely hooked on this topic, and I'm sure our listeners are too. We'll be back with the final part of our deep dive into Simon Kyaga's work, so stay tuned for even more mind-bending insights. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the work of Simon Kyaga, exploring this fascinating, really complex link between creativity and mental illness.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? Kayaga's research has really challenged a lot of my assumptions about this whole thing, given me a whole new way of thinking about this age-old question.
I'm right there with you. One of the things that really strikes me about Kyaga's work is just how honest he is about the limitations of this kind of research. He doesn't shy away from the fact that it's really difficult to measure something as slippery as creativity, and that we always have to be aware of, other factors that might be skewing the results.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. It's so refreshing to see a researcher who acknowledges that, we don't have all the answers, that there's still so much more to learn. And as we've been talking about, it's not like a simple cause and effect situation here.
Right. It's not like we can just say, mental illness causes creativity or the other way around. It's this really intricate interplay of genes, environment, personal experiences, cultural influences, all these threads kind of weaving together.
Mhm. Exactly. All those factors contribute to both our mental health and our creative potential, right? And you've hit on one of the biggest challenges in this field. How do you even define creativity? There's no single test, no perfect measurement that can capture it completely.
It's almost like trying to measure love or happiness or something.
Yeah.
Everyone experiences it so differently. What one person finds creative, another might not, right?
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider all those different perspectives and be cautious about making, big sweeping generalizations based on any single study.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, acknowledging the complexity. I don't know, embracing the mystery, maybe.
I like that. Embrace the mystery. And I think that's what Kyaga's work does so well. He brings together data from all these different sources, right? You have large-scale population studies, you have insights from genetics, brain imaging. He even brings in historical analysis. Like, he's looking at this question from every angle.
It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about trying to understand the human stories behind those numbers.
Exactly. And that's what makes this research so compelling. It's about exploring what it means to be human. To have this incredible capacity for creativity, but also this vulnerability to mental illness. It's about understanding, the full spectrum of human experience.
And it's about challenging the stigma that surrounds mental illness, right?
Absolutely. by showing that there might be like these shared roots between creativity and certain mental illnesses, I think Kyaga's work helps us see these conditions in a new light. And, it's not about romanticizing mental illness, but it is about understanding its complexities and recognizing the potential that might exist alongside the challenges.
So it's a message of hope then.
Yeah, I think so. It's a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can find ways to express itself, to create, to connect, to make meaning, and that's something worth celebrating.
That's beautifully put. Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you. If you had to kind of distill Kyaga's work down to one key takeaway for our listeners, what would it be?
Hmm, that's a tough one. I think the most important message is just that the relationship between creativity and mental illness is just far more intricate and nuanced than we often realize. It's not a simple formula like where madness equals genius or the other way around.
It's a spectrum
Yeah.
with all sorts of variations and combinations of creativity and mental health.
Exactly. And it's a spectrum that exists within all of us, I think. We all have this capacity for both creativity and vulnerability. It's about recognizing that, respecting that diversity, creating environments that support mental well-being and nurture creative expression and challenging the stigma that prevents people from reaching their full potential.
I love that. What a great note to end on. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us into the work of Simon Kyaga. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine. Really, it's a conversation I think we all need to be having.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, if this deep dive piqued your curiosity, we encourage you to explore Kyaga's work further. There's a whole world of fascinating research out there waiting to be discovered. So until next time, keep those creative sparks flying.